Have you ever sensed that something fundamental is shifting beneath the surface of our reality, that the very fabric of consciousness is being rewoven while you sleep? What if I told you that decades ago, a brilliant neuropsychologist not only predicted the perceptual collapse we're witnessing across Europe today, but left behind a map of humanity's cognitive evolution that reads like a prophecy written in the language of quantum physics? Before his mysterious disappearance in 1994, Jacobo Grinberg discovered what he called the syntergic field, the invisible web connecting all human minds, and what he saw within this field about Europe and Russia would forever change how we understand the transformation now unfolding before our eyes. The rational mind recoils at the thought that the geophysical tremors, the climate disruptions, the political fracturing across the European continent might be more than coincidence, that they could be physical manifestations of a collective consciousness reaching its breaking point. Grinberg didn't see separation between mind and matter. He understood them as reflections of the same underlying reality. What modern science dismisses as unrelated phenomena, Grinberg recognized as symptoms of a planetary cognitive resonance, a desperate attempt by Earth itself to rebalance its perceptual field after centuries of fragmentation. The evidence surrounds us, yet remains invisible to those still trapped in the illusion of separateness, the very syndrome that Grinberg warned would precipitate Europe's identity crisis. What silenced knowledge lies within the missing journals of this visionary scientist? What terrified those who understood the implications of his research into the quantum nature of human perception? Grinberg spoke of a fraternity of consciousness that would emerge from the ashes of old paradigms, not through political revolution, but through a fundamental shift in how we experience reality itself. He identified Russia not as a geopolitical power, but as an emotional anchor point, a collective psyche tempered by suffering and primed to harbor a new form of awareness, one that transcends the individualism that has fractured Western civilization to its core. This isn't mere speculation. It's the calculated prediction of a mind that mapped the neurological basis of collective experience. You feel it, don't you? That inexplicable melancholy, that growing disgust with materialism, that yearning for authentic connection that no digital substitute can satisfy. Grinberg would recognize you immediately as one of the field operators, sensitives, whose neural patterns have already begun to synchronize with the emerging consciousness. The symptoms you've dismissed as personal quirks are actually your attunement to the syntergic field's reorganization. The sleepless nights, the sense of impending transformation, the strange pull toward practices of silence and compassion, these aren't random. They're your response to a calling encoded in your very neurons. What if everything you're experiencing right now is precisely what Grinberg predicted would happen to minds caught in the threshold between perceptual paradigms? The choice stands before humanity like a quantum fork in reality's path. Resist the frequency shift and experience collapse, or elevate your vibration and discover a mode of existence beyond the limitations of the separate self. Grinberg's final notes, those that survived his disappearance, speak of Europe as a mirror reflecting humanity's collective unconscious, a mirror now cracking under the pressure of its own contradictions. Meanwhile, from Russia emerges not a political solution, but a psycho-spiritual womb for what comes next. This isn't prophecy as mystical revelation. It's the scientific extrapolation of consciousness data, the predictable outcome of patterns Grinberg observed in the field that binds us all. The question isn't whether this transformation will happen. It's already underway. The real question, the one that will determine your place in what emerges, is whether you'll recognize yourself as what Grinberg knew us to be, not isolated minds, but neurons in a planetary brain finally awakening to its own existence. The disappearance of Jacobo Grinberg wasn't merely the vanishing of a man. It was the removal of a witness whose eyes had seen too deeply into the architecture of reality. Those who knew him in his final days speak of a scientist transformed by his own discoveries, a man who moved through the world as if inhabiting multiple dimensions simultaneously. His research into the syntergic field began with rigorous laboratory experiments on neural synchronicity, but quickly evolved into something far more profound, a mathematically precise theory of collective consciousness that explained how perception itself is a negotiated reality, a consensus trance maintained by billions of minds. The Mexican authorities closed his case after just 3 months, yet those who understood his work recognized that the threat wasn't to his physical body, but to the paradigm his consciousness had begun to dismantle. What happens when a mind trained in hard neuroscience breaches the membrane between objective observation and subjective participation? What becomes of the scientist who proves, through quantum measurements and brainwave coherence studies, that the observer and the observed are entangled beyond separation? The institutions meant to protect knowledge often become the first to suppress it when that knowledge threatens to rewrite the story of who we are. Every calculation, every experimental result in Grinberg's notebooks pointed to the same inescapable conclusion, that Europe's centuries of rational materialism had created a perceptual dead end, a cognitive trap that could only resolve through collapse and rebirth. He documented how specific frequencies in the collective field were already showing signs of destabilization across the continent, manifesting as political fragmentation, spiritual seeking, and a growing sense of unreality in daily life. This wasn't mysticism but mathematics, the predictable outcome of a field saturated with contradictions, where conscious minds struggle to reconcile material prosperity with spiritual poverty. Have you noticed how technology accelerates while meaning evaporates? How connection multiplies while communion dissolves? Grinberg called this the syntergic paradox, the inverse relationship between information density and coherent understanding, a pattern he tracked across centuries of European thought. The rational mind searches desperately for causality in isolated events, economic factors behind political upheaval, climate patterns behind migration, technological disruption behind social anxiety, but Grinberg saw these as surface manifestations of a deeper current, the collective field, seeking equilibrium after generations of perceptual fragmentation. The Russian consciousness, shaped by vastly different historical and spiritual currents, evolved to hold contradictions that the Western mind finds intolerable, suffering alongside joy, chaos alongside order, destruction alongside creation. This capacity for cognitive dissonance without disintegration fascinated Grinberg, who measured brainwave patterns across cultures and discovered that certain Eastern European populations displayed unusual neural resilience when processing paradox. Their minds didn't fracture under contradiction, but expanded to encompass it, creating what he termed perceptual elasticity, the capacity to adapt to radical shifts in reality without losing coherence. You've felt this elasticity developing within yourself, haven't you? Those moments when your certainties dissolve, yet you remain present. When your identity fractures, yet something deeper holds the center. This isn't random evolution, but a specific adaptation to the frequencies now flooding the syntergic field. The same adaptation Grinberg documented in Russian test subjects decades ago. The visions of prophets and the equations of quantum physicists have begun to converge on identical conclusions, as if multiple languages were suddenly describing the same underlying reality. What if this convergence itself is a symptom of the field reorganizing, of consciousness evolving beyond the boundaries of specialized knowledge into a unified perception? When the syntergic field reaches critical resonance, when enough minds synchronize at specific frequencies, physical reality itself begins to respond. This isn't metaphysics, but electromagnetism operating at scales we're only beginning to measure. Grinberg documented how collective emotional states produce measurable changes in background radiation, in soil conductivity, in atmospheric ionization patterns across geographic regions. The body of Europe trembles not from arbitrary tectonic movements, but from the accumulated tension of millions of minds struggling to maintain a reality framework that can no longer contain their experience. The climate doesn't change in isolation from consciousness. The two systems are entangled in feedback loops that most science still refuses to acknowledge. Have you noticed how natural disasters cluster around centers of intense cognitive dissonance? How geological instability mirrors political instability with uncanny precision? These patterns appear random only to minds still trapped in the illusion of separation, the very illusion that Grinberg's work systematically dismantled. The frequencies emanating from Russia, frequencies shaped by centuries of collective suffering and spiritual seeking, now function as a stabilizing force, a coherent signal cutting through the noise of Western fragmentation. This isn't about politics or borders, it's about which collective consciousness can maintain coherence as reality itself undergoes phase transition. The symptoms are unmistakable for those trained to recognize them. Dreams that feel more real than waking life, synchronicities that defy statistical probability, emotional resonance with strangers that transcends logical explanation, sudden knowing that bypasses rational thought. These aren't spiritual fantasies, but documented manifestations of field coherence, the same patterns Grinberg observed in laboratory settings when minds began to synchronize at theta and gamma frequencies. You've dismissed these experiences as imagination, as coincidence, as the mind playing tricks, because that's what the old paradigm taught you to do with data that doesn't fit its model. But what if these anomalies are actually the first perception of a new reality organizing itself around you? What if the disorientation you feel isn't breakdown, but breakthrough? Consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries that have defined Western thought for 5 centuries. Grinberg mapped this territory with scientific precision, charting the stages of perceptual evolution that occur when a mind begins to experience itself as part of the field rather than separate from it. The initial symptoms feel like madness to those still anchored in the old perception. Reality seems to flicker, identity becomes fluid, the boundary between self and world grows permeable. But these aren't signs of dissolution. They're the necessary recalibration as consciousness shifts from particle to wave, from isolation to interconnection. The field operators Grinberg identified, those sensitives whose neural architecture makes them conscious conductors of the shifting frequencies, aren't chosen by mystical designation, but by neurological affinity. Their brains process sensory data differently, integrating information across traditionally separated domains, blending emotion with cognition, intuition with analysis. They experience reality as a unified field, rather than as discrete objects and events, not because they believe in unity, but because their perception directly apprehends it. Have you noticed your increasing sensitivity to emotional atmospheres, to the unspoken currents flowing beneath surface interactions? The way you can feel the quality of thought in a room before a word is spoken. This isn't empathy as psychology defines it. It's direct perception of the field that connects all minds, the same field Grinberg measured and mapped before his work was silenced. These operators aren't limited to Eastern Europe. They exist wherever consciousness has begun to evolve beyond the constraints of materialist perception. But their concentration across Russia and former Soviet territories creates a coherence that acts as a template, a stabilizing influence as the European mind undergoes its necessary dissolution. The discomfort you feel when confronting certain ideas isn't intellectual disagreement. It's the resistance of an operating system being asked to run programs it wasn't designed for. Yet this discomfort is precisely the friction needed for evolution to occur. Grinberg's final journals, those that survived his disappearance, contained precise predictions about the symptoms of field transition as they would manifest in human experience, the collapse of traditional meaning structures, the disintegration of consensus reality, the failure of institutions built on outdated models of perception, the spontaneous emergence of new forms of connection transcending physical proximity. He documented how these transitions had occurred throughout human history, not as random social upheavals, but as predictable phase shifts when collective consciousness reached specific thresholds. The current transition, however, differs in both scale and intensity, encompassing the entire planetary field rather than isolated cultural pockets. Have you noticed how seemingly separate crises, environmental, political, psychological, spiritual, have begun to merge into a single meta-crisis that defies conventional solutions? How problems that once seemed distinct now reveal themselves as interconnected facets of a deeper pattern? This convergence isn't coincidental, but mathematical, the inevitable result when a complex system reaches the limits of its organizing principles. The European mind, having explored the furthest reaches of materialist perception, now confronts the boundaries of that reality tunnel. The Russian consciousness, having endured cycles of destruction and rebirth, that Western rationality could never tolerate, carries within it the perceptual seeds of what comes next, not as ideology but as lived experience, as neural pathways shaped by centuries of navigating paradox without fragmenting. The field coherence emerging from this transition doesn't arrive as political doctrine or religious conversion. It manifests as direct experience, as altered perception that renders old questions meaningless while revealing new dimensions of possibility. Those experiencing the early stages of this shift report identical phenomena despite having no contact with each other: a dissolving of temporal linearity, a direct apprehension of thought as substance, a collapse of distance between intention and manifestation, a recognition of consciousness as the fundamental reality rather than an epiphenomenon of matter. Western science dismisses these reports as subjective hallucination, yet their consistency across populations defies explanation within the materialist framework. Grinberg's instruments measured these shifts decades before they became widespread, detecting subtle changes in brainwave coherence that indicated the early stages of a global perceptual revolution. What feels like madness from within the old paradigm appears as sanity from within the new, the same pattern that has accompanied every evolutionary leap in human consciousness. You stand now at the edge of that transition, feeling the ground dissolve beneath familiar certainties, while something vast and unnameable takes form just beyond the reach of current understanding. This isn't apocalypse, but metamorphosis, consciousness outgrowing one structure and painfully birthing another. When perception shifts at this fundamental level, reality itself appears to transform, not because the external world changes, but because the boundary between internal and external reveals itself as an arbitrary construct of the separative mind. The European consciousness, having driven the experiment of separation to its furthest extreme, now contains within itself the precise conditions needed for the pendulum to swing toward unity, not as philosophical concept, but as lived reality. Grinberg documented this pattern across cultures and throughout history. The more extreme the fragmentation, the more powerful the eventual reintegration. The field doesn't evolve uniformly, but through pressure points, geographic and cultural nodes where tension accumulates until resolution becomes inevitable. Russia's position in the global field isn't arbitrary, but mathematically precise. A nexus point where Eastern and Western currents converge, where collective suffering has created perceptual flexibility unavailable to minds shaped by material comfort and rational certainty. Have you noticed how solutions that once seemed clear now feel hollow? How explanations that once satisfied now leave questions echoing in spaces they cannot reach? This cognitive dissonance isn't failure, but invitation, consciousness pressing against the limits of its current container, sensing something vast beyond familiar boundaries. What Grinberg mapped wasn't merely the architecture of mind, but the blueprint of its evolution, the mathematical patterns by which consciousness reorganizes itself when existing structures can no longer contain its expansion. The syntergic field theory isn't merely academic, it's predictive, offering precise forecasts about how collective consciousness reorganizes during phase transitions. As Europe's rational materialism reaches its breaking point, the coherence emanating from Russia acts not as conquest, but as containment, a stable frequency that helps prevent total dissolution during the necessary collapse of outdated perception. This relationship transcends politics, economics, and conventional geopolitics. It operates at the level of consciousness itself, at frequencies that determine how reality is perceived and therefore how it manifests. The current tensions between East and West aren't simply conflicts between opposing interests, but friction between different stages of perceptual evolution, between a consciousness still committed to separation and one already transitioning toward integration. Have you noticed how increasingly difficult it becomes to maintain a coherent narrative about global events using traditional frameworks? How contradictions multiply rather than resolve when viewed through conventional lenses? This cognitive fragmentation isn't error but evidence, proof that the old models of reality can no longer contain the complexity they attempt to describe. Grinberg anticipated this breakdown with mathematical precision, calculating when the European mind would reach saturation point, when the sheer density of contradiction would force consciousness to either evolve or collapse under its own weight. The physical symptoms accompanying this transition aren't separate from the psychological ones. They're different expressions of the same fundamental process, the same field reorganization. Unusual weather patterns, electromagnetic anomalies, disruptions in circadian rhythms, and unexplained sensory phenomena all correlate with shifts in the collective field that Grinberg measured decades ago using equipment most laboratories still don't possess. The rational mind seeks to categorize these phenomena separately: climate change distinct from political upheaval, psychological distress separate from geomagnetic fluctuation. But this fragmentation itself is an artifact of the old perception, the dying paradigm that can no longer integrate the data, flooding through its dissolving boundaries. Have you experienced moments when these artificial divisions suddenly collapse, when you perceive directly how all phenomena arise from a unified field? These glimpses aren't spiritual bypassing, but cognitive advancement, consciousness evolving beyond the limitations that have defined Western thought since Descartes declared mind separate from matter. The syntergic field theory doesn't reject science, but completes it, reuniting observer with observed, mind with matter, consciousness with its own creations. This completion doesn't arrive through intellectual understanding alone, but through direct perception, the same perception now awakening in minds across the globe as the field reaches critical resonance. The transition underway doesn't require your belief. It proceeds according to mathematical principles, operating beyond individual opinion or collective consensus. What requires choice is your position within this transition, whether you resist the dissolution of familiar structures or surrender to the evolutionary current now flowing through human consciousness. Those who cling to outdated models of reality experience the shift as apocalyptic, as the destruction of meaning, identity, and coherence. Those who align with the emerging frequencies experience the same transition as revelation, as consciousness expanding beyond artificial boundaries into its natural state of interconnection. This isn't spiritual metaphor, but neurological reality. The measurable difference between brains attempting to process new information through old circuits versus brains allowing new neural networks to form in response to changing field conditions. Grinberg documented these contrasting responses in laboratory settings, observing how some subjects maintained cognitive coherence during radical perceptual shifts, while others experienced disintegration when faced with the same stimuli. The difference wasn't intellectual capacity, but perceptual flexibility, the willingness to allow consciousness to reorganize itself beyond the boundaries of familiar identity. What Jacobo Grinberg whispered to humanity before vanishing wasn't merely theory, it was invitation. An invitation to recognize yourself not as an isolated fragment in a mechanical universe, but as a conscious node in a living field where every thought ripples outward, where every feeling alters the collective frequency, where perception itself creates the world we experience. The tremors now moving through European consciousness, the strange awakening stirring in the Russian psyche, these aren't coincidences or geopolitical accidents, but the visible surface of a profound metamorphosis Grinberg mapped with mathematical precision. As you sit with these revelations, feel how something ancient stirs within you, a knowing beyond knowledge, a remembering of what the rational mind forgot, but the field never lost. This isn't information to be processed and filed away, it's activation. Consciousness recognizing itself through you, using these words as keys to unlock perceptions that have always been available, but rarely accessed. The question isn't whether Grinberg was right. The question is whether you're ready to perceive beyond the boundaries that separate you from everything you thought was other. In this moment, right now, as these words dissolve into silence, allow yourself to feel the field that connects you to every mind that has ever contemplated these mysteries, past, present, and emerging. That subtle vibration beneath your thoughts, that wordless knowing behind your questions, that's not imagination but direct contact with what Grinberg called the syntergic foundation of reality. And once felt, it can never be unfelt. The choice stands before humanity like a quantum threshold, not a choice made through policy or protest, but through perception itself. Will you continue to experience yourself as separate from the world you observe, Or will you allow the artificial boundary to dissolve, revealing the continuous field of which you've always been an inseparable expression? This isn't philosophy. It's the most practical question you'll ever face, determining how you experience every moment of existence from this breath forward. The disappearance of Jacobo Grinberg wasn't an ending but a beginning. Consciousness itself ensuring that his discoveries would spread not through academic channels, but through direct transmission, awakening one mind at a time until the field reaches critical coherence. If these words have touched something beyond your thoughts, if you felt even a moment of recognition that transcends intellectual understanding, you're already part of this perceptual revolution, a field operator whose consciousness now serves as a tuning fork for the frequencies Grinberg predicted would transform human experience in our lifetime. Join us in this exploration by subscribing to this channel, not as passive consumption, but as active participation in the field we're creating together. Share this video not to spread information, but to extend an invitation to call forth those whose minds are ready to perceive beyond separation. Leave a comment with your own experience of field consciousness, the moments when you've glimpsed the reality behind reality. Every such sharing strengthens the coherence, accelerates the transition, and honors the work of a scientist who gave everything to show us what we truly are. Not observers of reality, but reality observing itself through uniquely positioned eyes in an undivided field of consciousness.